So are we ready to start? Can we put up the PowerPoint?
Yes. Can you see it?
I cannot.
You cannot see it. We can see it.
Oh, I can see
Me.
the sign that says your front conference sign, redefining masculinity.
Oh.
That's what I see. Would it be? I still can pull up the presentation in the background. I just would need a moment to go retrieve it. You decide that that's the best. There it is. There it is. Good.
Yes.
You got it. So what we often talk about in working with men and boys and choosing respect, I entitled it the program Choose Respect Program because I wanted to identify what was the positive actions that that men were engaging in as they decided to choose a different way of being in their relationships. The work that I do is I provide an intervention program for men at an early stage, usually after some kind of domestic violence incident has occurred. And that during that, immediate after, could be any kind of systems people that are involved. Like could be the police, it could be another counselor, it could be the partner. We have safe houses here, and many of those women have asked that their men participate in a program because women often will say that they love their partner and that they would like to continue the relationship. They just want the abuse to stop, which is a distinction, I think. So we talk a lot about what actions we're choosing, as opposed to just looking at the problem from, of course, we're ending violence against women, but we're also trying to identify what is the space that we'd like to fill in that space between. So next slide, please.
I think you can change slides by yourself now. I
can change slides. Whoa.
Try.
Let's try it. Doesn't look like it.
Nope. Perfect.
Nope.
So, okay, I can.
There we go.
Sorry.
So this slide is just a little bit about just recognizing that there are a lot of ways that we talk about this in the sort of mainstream society, and the ways in which we understand violence and abuse against women, but also the reasons why people use violence and abuse. And I think this is important because when we think about the social context in which we're working, and we think about, for example, the space that this happens in, we're often thinking a little bit about how does it happen that it continues so much? And why is it so difficult to change? And some of that is a little bit about the narratives and the conversations that are held about this topic. And although we've learned a lot about how the social conditions, potentially patriarchy and gender-based violence is entrenched in the ways that we understand relationships. We recognize too that some of the ways that we're talking about it are not necessarily, responding, to why it is that people are using violence and abuse, or what decisions they can make to act differently. So some of the pictures here, you can kind of see them as you look around. These are some of the common things that people might say. You might even recognize for you as you think about it. Yeah, this is what I have heard or understand the reasons are, For example, the volcano analogy is one that shows up quite a bit in our discourse in, when we talk about, that the pressure's building inside and we're getting more and more frustrated and things are difficult in the society and the world and our relationships. And suddenly, all of a sudden, we just blow up, right? And that there's an element of that. There's a pretty strong link between the use of alcohol and the use of violence. That somehow that potentially might create the conditions for that violence and abuse to show up, right? We've learned a lot about, structure and how society is hierarchical, and that there's this idea that some folks need to have more power and privilege than others, and that in a gendered society, that we would be privileging the experience of men over women, and there would be some of these norms would show up in the family, for example, or in relationships, in the way that we understand how people interact with each other. Another way that people talk about it is, this is actually some kind of a problem that you have, like you're not well, you're sick, there's a medical reason. Maybe you're disturbed, or you're mentally ill, or that kind of thing. Sometimes these ideas about violence and abuse are about passion. This idea that somehow we feel so strongly in these relationships, and it's why in intimate partner relationships there's the sight of violence or abuse seems to be there. And this is a really not an uncommon one. Maybe some of you might recognize some of these. So, you're welcome to throw in a comment at any point if you have any questions. But so these are some of the ways that we talk about abuse and violence. Now, the reason why we bring this up is because when we recognize the way we talk about things, what we're doing is we sometimes are reproducing the very structures in our society that we're trying to change and address. And one of the biggest and most important and problematic stories or ways of talking about this is that men do not have any control over their behavior. If you can look at all of these kinds of reasons for abuse, these are all conditions that act on the person and somehow create an outcome and a way of behaving that is almost without their control. So when we think about the dominant stories, the dominant ways that we talk about it in society, we say a lot of things that take men and boys out of responsibility and out of the ability to decide how to act. So, as you think about choosing respect, that's an action. That's an action we take as an individual, a decision. And so one of the most important first things that we always think about is how to talk about abuse in a way that allows a person to consider and change their behavior. So you can put to the next slide, please. So just definitely wanting to make a bit of a recognition. Some of you may have heard of Alan Wade's work. And Alan Wade he may even be here, I'm not sure. But Alan has done a tremendous amount of work in trying to recognize this way that we position people as the effect of something as opposed to a responding, interacting, active agent in their circumstances. He also talks about that there are 4 tenets of interpersonal violence that we need to understand and consider as we try to approach our use of violence or the people's use of violence that we're working with. So violence being social, deliberate, unilateral, and victim resistance is always present. We've been running our program, Men Choose Respect, for the last 10 years. We have 700 men have gone through the program. And there's a very strong connection between agency or the ability to choose and the decision how to be differently in your situations and their changes in abusive behavior. Next slide, please. Dignity is a central principle in this. I think that for people to feel valuable as human beings, they have to have a sense that they can influence their own lives. And one of the things that people fight the hardest about as they try to address their use of violence and abuse is that it's not really a favorable image to have in the world, that you've used violence and abuse. So people don't talk about it. They don't talk about it as choices of behavior. They talk about it as character. That, if I'm an abusive person, that somehow this says a lot about who I am. And it makes it very difficult for people to be able to talk about it. And this is in part because the thing we fight for more than anything, I think, in our experience of being human is our sense of dignity, our personal value, our capacity to act on the world in a way that just somehow, I don't know, there's integrity, there's a sense of who we are. So agency and capacity is connected to dignity. We believe this completely as the way in which we can move towards change. Next slide, please.
Yes.
So this is very much what Ellen Wade has been putting forward, is that there are operations of language that happen in our society that conceals the violence, somehow takes away the perpetrator's responsibility. It will conceal or erase victim resistance, and it tends to blame or pathologize victims. And it's the way we talk about it that somehow creates the permissive social context for these actions to continue. So when we're working with people as therapists and as counselors and as people in the field, the nature of our dialogue with the people that are doing this, that are using violence and abuse, similarly the way we speak with victims, we must be considering, how it is that we are not only reinforcing their value and their dignity, but that we are talking about them as active and capable human beings. Next slide. So this is, and this might be a place where the language doesn't quite translate, but in Canada or many, I think in the English language, we talk a little bit about, an example of this might be pushing someone's buttons. We often, sometimes men will say, the only reason I did what I did is because she pushed my buttons. And it's like this idea, and this is a button over here in the bottom corner, that the idea is that somebody can come along and reach inside you and push a button and something spontaneous will happen. Some way of acting will come from you that is completely out of your control. And that's going to be the cause of your behavior, right? Also, we have seen over the last number of decades, increasingly that this is being seen as a mental illness. So people are going on a couch and or particularly talking to a counselor and say, come on, fix me, make me not do this anymore. And what that also does is the action for change is residing outside of you as opposed to inside of you. And that's the shift we want to make. Next slide, please. So victim blaming, as I've mentioned before, is a very, very, very prevalent in the societal discourses, that somehow the victim is responsible for the violence that's happened against her. And I think this is really important because what that does is it takes responsibility off the person who's using the actions. For example, this duck hunting, maybe you should ask yourself why you're inviting all this duck hunting into your life right now. I mean, this is sometimes the way we talk with people.
Oh, sorry.
At certain days, but it is sometimes the way we communicate. No, that's okay. You can move it to the next one. Go ahead. So context is important, though. And as we know, we've understood, and probably the best gains we've made in the area of intimate partner violence, violence against women, is to understand that we live in a gendered social context and that there are social conditions that really can influence and contribute to the range of options that we have available to us. It's the meaning making we make of the world. It's the way that we see. I often say in group, it's the super N. When we understand the world through our particular set of lenses, we have our glasses on and we see the world. We see it through not just as it is, but how we interpret it. And our society and the way that social causes are really, really important to consider. The difference between talking about context and talking about a cause-effect relationship is the significant difference. Because when we tell people that they are they are the product of their society, that they are a product of, toxic masculinity, for example. That is important for them to think about. But what's more important is not for them to see themselves as an object of that condition, but as an interactive responding agent within that situation, so that they determine whether or not what parts of masculinity do they feel that they would like to set down. And most people are grappling with this all the time. It is a part of us to look and to be in. Like when we think about how we were raised by our families, we think, well, my father used violence and abuse with my mother. If I think that to myself, and I can decide I'm not going to be like that. That's my decision, to not be a person that is the same as my father. The fact that we can do that, the fact that we can grow up and decide to be different than our parents, suggests that it's less of a cause-effect relationship and more of understanding ourselves as being able to interact with those events. So we can see this all the time, because when men and boys give reasons and excuses for their behavior, what they're trying to say to you, I think, is that I actually know that what I'm doing is not okay. I understand that I'm using behavior that's contrary to the way I want to act. But there are good reasons for me to behave this way. The biggest reason that men say they use violence and abuse is the other person's behavior, which is an interesting, thing to say, that, the use of violence is an automatic reaction to other people acting badly. So people will spend a lot of time explaining why they've done what they've done, because they want you to know they're actually good people making decisions that make sense. So we see people as the actor in their own story. That's important, because if you're the actor in your own story, then you could influence your own story, and you can maybe create the story that you want. Next slide, please. So what that does is, when we actually share conversations with people that sees them as capable of influencing how they behave in the world, they are actually then beginning to think, well, I can consider then how I would like to act differently. To have conversations that provide more reasons for people's use of violence that is outside of them takes people off the hook for that use of violence. And, we have spent, and this is very, very important, a lot of time in gender-based violence and working with helping victims be safe, working with victims to heal and recover from their experiences. What we're learning is that we will never end violence and abuse. We will never end violence against women unless we include conversations with men and boys who are using violence. And that you can think of, many of you are probably already can recognize in yourself, is that the decisions we make about acting respectfully and in a caring way and in a safe way with others are decisions that we make. Some of the things we can do when we talk about abuse with men and boys is we can provide clear and accurate accounts of what is happening. We're it's not a shake your finger at situation, but it is at a point of being clear about who is doing what to whom. But the person, asking a person, what do you want to do about this? How do you want to change this behavior? Then, what is it you'd like it to look like differently? That's very, very helpful. Next slide, please. So the idea of this as a counselor, and this is how I would work, and the people that have work in our programs that I've been assisting over the last number of years, what we do is we ask questions to gain a picture of the interaction or event. We're trying to get a sense of the person in their context, and that understanding what they're doing is responding and likely overcoming the resistance of someone else. So They may be trying to manage or control the person's behavior. They may be trying to decide how things are supposed to go in this particular situation. They may want to dominate an outcome. They may want to change somebody else's actions or behavior and have them listen and respond to what they do. So when we gain a picture of an interaction, we bring the person into the conversation, highlight them as an actor in that. We notice how they are responding and interacting with the situations that are there, including decisions to not behave a particular way. Or a decision to maybe not act as severely. Ellen Wade talks about a very prominent example where somebody is, they decide to, instead of, they may be verbally abusive as opposed to using a physical violence, for example, as that decision to go one direction or the other. So focusing on responses instead of effects, the things that happen to you, is the effect, and how we act on things is your response, brings you as the person or the person you're speaking with into the subject position. Next slide, please. So the counselor gets an account of the interaction of what's happening, and who is doing what to whom, how it is that he's responding in that, and the direction of the behavior towards each other. So unilateral behavior is directional. It's sometimes, this is some of the work of Linda Coates and also Alan Wade around this idea that we talk about violence in relationships as a mutual act, something that men and women are doing together, as though they had a fight, for example. Next slide, please. The most important part of the response-based interview or the conversation that we have with men and boys to about changing their behavior is that they know already what it is that they're doing, and that if we recognize them as capable and wanting to be in their relationships in a good way, that we will be able to notice and observe what changes they might want to make. And in that way, it is a dignifying practice, because we see people as being valuable, knowledgeable, capable of caring, and being in safe and respectful relationships. Next slide, please. So pre-existing capacity means they walk in the door with everything they need. And as many times as people have used violence and abuse, if you talk with them, you can learn about examples when they have acted in a way that's caring and loving. And I mean, we know this when we speak with victims a lot, that it's hard for a woman to leave the relationship because she has many examples of how, her partner, this father of her family, has been a loving and caring person. And, as much as people do use violence and abuse, it's very rarely all that they are. In fact, there are also, they know there's many, many examples of when they've acted well. And it's from there that we can harvest their decisions to act well in the future. So some of the ways we have those conversations, we'll ask people, what do they do? How do they, tell me a little bit about how you handle the good situation. What is it that as they move through the program, they might describe, okay, this situation happened. Normally I would have had this reaction, and now I'm deciding to respond like this. Asking them, how do they want to contribute to the safety of their family? Is the safety and the well-being of their family important? Are the people that they care about important to them in some way? What would they like them to experience, Sometimes I've heard conversations about, relationships that they have that are respectful elsewhere. It's not with everyone that they act this way. Now, if it was just a reaction, that would be impossible. Asking people, what kind of relationships do you actually want? That they, If you were to be in this relationship, what parts of it did you really like about it in the beginning? What parts of it are the parts that you value? What are you doing to create that, to make it possible? What are you doing that creates that, connection and safety within the family or within your personal relationships? Even the question of what are you working on can be incredibly valued. And the one that I find is really, really useful, and one that we talk about in our program a lot, is that each of us have to create a line that we don't want to cross. It's a decision we make as human beings, as a moral agent, as someone who acts in the world. We all have to decide, where is that line that we don't want to cross? And my guess is most people that I speak to will say that those actions that they've used when they've decided to use abuse and violence are lines that they would like to not cross, that they're not happy about their behavior, that they are regretting that happened, and when they look at it, they would have liked to have acted differently. So the next slide, please. So this is just a parts of an interview that I had with a colleague of mine. He has been working in my program as a co-facilitator in a group. We do a group that is 9 weeks long, and we walk through a series of conversations that are many of the parts that I've just described to you. But this is an example of an interview in a very first session. And I'm just going to give you a couple of little bits back and forth so you can kind of see how we might ask the question and how we might talk about, people's use of violence and abuse or their behavior in a way that helps them consider change. So this is not a real person, but my colleague, his name is Sean. He has given me consent to use this interaction. And he has also done a composite of some of the stories that we've heard over the years. There have been many, many men who've gone through the program. This scenario that Sean is talking about, he is talking to me from a motel, and he has separated from his partner, and he has had to, he is concerned, he's been at the view of the authorities that he has been using violence and abuse. And he says that the reason he uses that violence and abuse is because he's concerned about his partner's drinking, that she has been using alcohol to an excess and she's not caring for the children properly. And he is concerned about that. And that is why he's being abusive. Now, you'll notice that I can understand the context that he's in, but not accept the fact that there is only one inevitable choice in that regard. So next slide, please. So this is me talking with Sean. We were just talking a little bit about when you decided to change. You know a little bit about it. It was a decision inside of you. He says, yeah, right. It's hard. And I ask him, how did you do it? How did you manage it? And this is a great question to ask when somebody, when in this conversation, I asked him a little bit about it, what he knew about change. And because he was concerned about his partner not changing. And, what I wanted him to have is a sense or talk about what he knew about change, not only for himself, but how he understood her. So he explains that for him that change was possible because he also struggled with alcohol in the early days, is that he had to stick through it, that he had to realize that it was for the kids. He had to have a motivation, a reason for change. And connecting to that reason for change is really useful in the interview, is what are your reasons for changing and acting differently? And he says, because I don't want them to grow up like I did, where I had a dad who was a drinker too. And this is not uncommon. People will say that they learned a lot of how they are acting and behaving when they were children. And absolutely, it can have an influence on the choices you make. But it is very possible. And in fact, as many people who decide not to be like their parents as they might be similar to their parents. You can think about that in your own life. Places in which you decided to be different than your parents. Next slide, please. So context and behavior, seeing behavior as something you do. That's why I say men who use abuse. You'll notice that. It's a behavior that you use. It's not a character flaw. It's not emotion. You know, people I often say is abuse a feeling? Maybe it's driven by a feeling. Maybe it's a response to a feeling. But if it's a behavior, an action, then it is and you see it as a response to the conditions that are around you, then you can decide to do different, and you can decide to act different. And you probably have many examples when you've acted differently in the past. So I asked him a little bit more about context, so I can get a sense of what is he responding to, who is doing what to whom. Often when people come in, they're only talking about one split second and a moment of this is what happened, like the effect or the end result of what's going on, you know. In fact, they'll talk about the behavior they feel most comfortable with, which is usually the other person's behavior, right? In this case, Sean was talking about his wife drinking too much and being on the couch when he would come home from work. And that when he would be so angry with her when he came home and found her on the couch and the children were hungry, that he would go and he would be yelling with her and angry at her and aggressive and at times violent. So I asked him a little bit about when things started to change and get hard. And I talked about and recognized his worry about her sobriety and whether or not she was able to manage that. Now, again, talking about what is he doing and how did he respond to that, and when did he notice he was doing things well. Next slide, please. So I asked him about, when he came in the door, if he came and he approached her right as soon as he walked in the door. And when he came in the door, did he go straight up to her and yell at her for being on the couch and not taking care of the children? And is that when the violence and abuse occurred, right? And he would say, no, I would come in and I would take care of the kids and I would go and make sure that they had had their dinner and take them and put them to bed. And then I would go to her and say, what the heck is going on here? And I don't like what you're doing. And he would then use aggression when that happened. And that was the place, the moment. Now, as you can imagine, he's thinking that his behavior is justified. His use of abuse is about telling her she's doing bad things. And so, which is often the case, people don't usually say, I just was violent for no reason. They typically will say, I was violent because so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that. So I asked a little bit about what's important about that. Why is it important not to argue in front of the kids? I want to know what he thinks. Why? And he says that my parents argued all the time. So I hated it. And my dad and my mom would argue in front of my brother. So you know what this is like, I said. And he said, yeah. So I try not to do it in front of the kids. Because he still wants to put blame on her starting the fight, in a sense. Which is possible, in the sense that, but what we were able to discover is that most of these incidents were happening when he was angry with her for what he felt was the right reason. Next slide, please. So, I go back to him telling me that he has also struggled with alcohol in the past. And I, asked him a little bit about what's helpful and what works, what helps to try to come and approach her on that. And he says in the beginning, I started to really try to encourage her. I started going back to the meetings and get help. And I tried to support her. And the phrase I say, you were kind at first. And what I'm trying to do here is notice that he has not always used abuse as a strategy in addressing her behavior of drinking. He has also used incidences of kindness. When we think about it and we harvest through what are people doing that we want to see more of, or that is actually a positive and supportive behavior, a safety behavior, you might say, that you would begin to illuminate that and you would kind of emphasize that. So calling it kindness was my word, but that was something that we then begin to pull through the interview as we move through. So I said, you were kind at first. And then he says, yeah, but this has been going on for a long time. So this clear thing here is at some point, he decided to not be kind anymore. And he's telling us all the reasons why that kindness is no longer something he's deciding to do. But as active and an agent that he is in acting kindly, so is he also an active agent in acting badly. So I start to ask him more about kindness and letting him tell me more, you know. And so these are some of the things I'd ask those, tell me what kindness looks like. So when you were being kind, what would you be doing? If I was a fly on the wall, or if I was there in the room, what would I notice? And so he says, well, I would say to her, you know, we talked about we didn't want to go back that way. You're sliding a bit. It's good to get back on. If you're needing help, he offered her. And I said, you know, you gave encouragement. So I'll name and identify the strength and the skill, the capacity that people are using, the behaviors they're choosing to use that are actually reinforcing of the kind of person they want to be, you know. And she says, yeah, go to the meetings. And he says, yeah, you wanted her to understand. And he says, yeah, get a mentor, someone who can help. And so, you know, and I've reflected back that you're getting feedback about what you're worried about. You know, and so then it just got to the point she stopped caring and so on. But at some point he also did, you know, his behaviors of kindness weren't working. And so he began to look at other ways to try to dominate the outcome, you know. And the key part of this conversation is that his use of aggression wasn't changing her behavior either. And this is when he said, when I asked him about that, how effective is that? You know, he said that, so it's not even about, you know, you shouldn't do that, because of course he knows that he shouldn't do that. What the question is I understand why you use that behavior, but what is it you would prefer to do differently? And what is it that you think would be better about that? And when do you have examples when you've done that in the past? You know, because everyone walks in the door with everything they need to be in relationships in a positive way. And it's this central belief, I think, that feeds me and feeds the work that we do. As, you know, these are people who can choose respect. Next slide. So this is when he's saying, well, how helpful is this? And what is she telling you by her behavior, right? And she's telling him to leave her alone. He doesn't, you know, she's beginning, and this is where we start thinking about resistance. You know, when people are oppressed or mistreated, they often, and they typically do, either overtly or inside, resist what's happening to them. And this is another contribution of Alan Wade's work, is that recognizing resistance is important. In the context of working with men and boys, is that, if, you know, people who use violence and abuse, they expect to get resistance. So they work to overcome it. And sometimes their excuses and the reasons why they so-called are deciding to act the way that they are is a way to overcome that resistance of the other person, right? To do victim blaming, or to decide that, you know, they have no choice but to act this way because they have the moral ground of some kind. You know, it really gets to be about, you know, oftentimes about dominance, about who decides how this should go. Next slide, please. So the question on focusing on change, what do you want to work on? What do you want to do differently? You know, he says, what do you want to work on? He says, well, I don't want to lose my shit. I don't want to lose, you know, my temper, my actions. I don't want to do this anymore. Okay, so when you're not doing that, what would you be doing? You know, because if we take a behavior out of our repertoire, if we decide that someone says, I don't want to do this anymore, you got to have a good conversation about what it is that they're going to be doing differently. Because we cannot change a behavior unless we put something in its place. If we believe that a behavior has a function, that it's instrumental, that we use behavior for a reason, that we're responding to the context that we're in. You know, even if we think about all those social conditions that might have created the options for behavior for us, that maybe put us in a position of either, gender norms or power or other kinds of reasons we may decide to act the way we do. It's still one choice amongst others. Otherwise, everyone that was raised in an abusive home would be violent, and it's just not the case. Next slide. So the idea of having conversations, it's more than about responsibility. It's about inviting their responsibility, right? To be able to have the capacity to respond to the events and the conditions that are around them. I think it's a little bit like, riding a kayak in a really rough river. And I talk about this story or this metaphor quite often in the work that I do. Because when we're in the canoe or in a kayak and we're navigating the river, there are many things we cannot control and influence. But how we are in that kayak, how it is that we respond and interact with what's in front of us, we make moment by moment decisions in assessing how we want to be in that. A person who is just sitting in the boat is likely going to tip over or maybe crash onto the rocks, right? And it's about taking charge of your own life. That agency becomes the vehicle of change. And when we have conversations with people that understands the conditions that they're in, but don't find it that that's the only way they can behave, then it's important to notice the difference, that they can then decide to navigate their own canoe or their own kayak. Next slide, please. And when people look into the future of the kind of relationship that they want to have, maybe a situation in which they no longer cross the lines that they've set for themselves. The things that they might say, and these are the ways that people will measure that they may change. They talk about their use of abuse as a decision, an action that they take, as something that they don't want to do anymore. They can identify being non-abusive even when others are acting badly, as we can. That's what we can do. That they know the conditions that might be around them that might contribute to their decision to use abuse. And you can notice the agency in that using a decision. And I know what to do to not be abusive in the future. And the most important is that people do have a great understanding of safety, dignity, and respect. And even that question alone, is this how you want to be in this? Does this connect with the values you have about the kind of partner you want to be, the kind of father you want to be, the kind of man you want to be? How does it connect with those values? I think that connects with who we are. And acting consistently with those values is a goal we all have. So this isn't a conversation with some bad people. This is a human conversation. And when we have those human conversations with people, I think that we connect with the person we want to be and the way we want to be in the world. So next slide, please. So these are things that men will say when they are finished the program. They take ownership of their responses. They are mine alone. I learned what abuse is on a whole new level, learning new skills of being a better listener, patience. I know that how I approach situations can influence how things will play out. Being in control of their own buttons. Only I can choose respect. And then it's up to me at all times to recognize the situation and take control of myself to be calm and positive. And this seems to facilitate people's decision for change. And it's these conversations, when we have them with the people that we're working with, that can help them move through a decision to not be abusive in the future and choose respect instead. Next slide, please. So this is, I'm really interested in any questions you might have. This is the way that we work. we find we're absolutely grateful to Alan Wade and Linda Coates and some of the other people that have worked with Alan Wade and Nick Todd and a number of others that you may be familiar with. But this work has a big, quite a large legacy before we came along. And it has transformed my working experience. And I would say working with men and boys who are using abuse and violence is the most inspiring work I've ever done. Because when people decide that they can change that they can be in the world differently and have the kinds of relationships they want, I'm just struck by how much men want this and how much they feel this is finally a conversation that can engage with how I want to be and how I want to, change the way that I am in my life. So is there anybody have any questions? I don't know how you might work that technology-wise, but I'm open to any conversations. We can take down the PowerPoint as well.
Yeah. All right. Here goes nothing. Yeah, we're gonna bring you back to us, Theresa. He's gonna.
How are we doing for time?
You're fine.
Okay, good.
You started a bit later than we anticipated. We just need Theresa. I can see you, Theresa. Now everyone can see you. Everyone can see you now, Theresa. Right.
So,
oh my.
Any questions? Anybody? Maybe you folks can help me with that on that. And if there's any questions at all that people might have about the work we're doing.
Can you? Is it a YouTube question?
No, it's a question from me.
Oh, from you.
I have a voice too.
Sorry. Shit.
No, I was just wondering, maybe you have repeated this before in your mic.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about differences and/or similarities between working with men as individuals as compared to working as a group?
Okay.
Can you repeat the question for me when you?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Can you give some examples? Is there any differences and/or similarities with working with men and boys individually and in group?
Oh, very, very good. I think the benefits of working in group context is that you have not only sort of peer support for some of the dominant messages that men and boys have been receiving for some time, right? Thinking that sometimes there's messages about, masculinity or others about being strong or stoic, or you don't tell each other your feelings, or, many people have never sat with other folks in a room and had conversations about relationships. So, I would say that the method is similar. I use dialogue style in both cases. I'm trying to generate what they have to say. In the group, I write a lot of stuff, what they say, and put it up on a flip chart behind me so that they can see their own words. Like I might track down a list of all the skills that they've talked about in an opening round. We might go around the room and I ask people to share something in the week that went well, something that they did, some interaction and what they did to make that go well. And we identify some of those things in the very beginning. So we're naming and recognizing all the actions that they're taking that promote safety and respect. So it's similar. And it just, in a group, you kind of have to do some turn taking and facilitate a way of talking about it that sometimes the engagement is different. You want folks to be able to feel they can talk and join in.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Should we do one more question? Yes.
How do you practice your skills in talking about responses instead of
Okay. How do you practice your skills in talking about responses
Yes.
instead of effects?
It's funny because, you know, when I started first doing this work and working with Alan, was about learning and paying attention to my own language. And I'll tell you, you know, we are in a world where we talk about how things land on us, not about how we influence our world. And what happens, the more we talk about effects, the more powerless we feel. So for me, I guess it's where I wanted to connect with agency. And so it takes practice, but I notice where I place the person in the story. If I haven't, I don't have an image or a picture in my mind of where the person who's speaking, noise outside, where the person is speaking, where they are in the story, then I have to talk about it differently. And so that's where maybe I think I look for ways to recognize when I do talk about how the person is only at the mercy of the world that they're in. So it's a lot of, you know, what are I statements? You know, like the pronoun I. If a person is saying, I did this, I did so and so and so and so, then they are in the actor position. So, and when I'm talking with them, I want to know, how are you in that? Not what happened to you. That's the difference. That's the turn, right? So if I had to ask people what happened to you, if I only talk about impact, I'm not considering how they're responding to that event. Because even if something happens to you, what's more interesting and more important and the place of change is how you interact and respond to that event. Even when you've had a terrible thing happen as a victim, you know, you still, because what you do is you get the nature of what's happened more clearly, but you also begin to step with that person towards a sense of, how do I live with this moving forward? What do I do next? And how do I recognize all the number of ways I've responded to this event?
Cool. All right, Theresa, I think we need to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I know it's very early over in Canada.
Yes,
Right?
I think the light's coming, the sun's coming up. So
Oh, shit. So
six,
thank
6
you.
o'clock, 6:41 a.m. in Canada.
Now?
Yes.
Oh my God, I was sad this morning when my alarm went off at 6:30.
Yeah. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference, and thank you so much for letting me come and have a little conversation with you. And I appreciate all of your hard work that you do in this area. It's important that we work together, you know, and when we share ideas, we make the world a better place. And it's we're not one yet, but I think we've made a lot of change over the time, and I appreciate everything that you do.
Well said. Thank you.